Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our webinar series of today, webinar number 4 of a 6-part webinar series focusing specifically on the aftermath, engaging with collective trauma in post-conflict situations. And in today's webinar, we are joined by a stellar cast of panelists who will be taking us through sharing some of their experiences, sharing some of their findings from research, from the work that they're doing as practitioners. We have Adam Kochansky, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University. We are also joined by Angie Yoda Maina, who is the Executive Director of Green String Network based in Kenya, in Nairobi, Kenya, who will be sharing with us specifically on the well-being and resilience, a grounded approach to healing-centered peace building. We are also joined by Federica Bubenza from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, who will be co-presenting with Professor Yvonne Sleep from critical community health specialist, who is a critical community health specialist and social scientist from the University of KZN in South Africa. They will be speaking to us, sharing some of their work that they have been doing in a number of countries, including South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. And they will specifically focus on co-creating an integrated approach to mental health and psychosocial support and peace building. And these findings are findings from the work that they have been doing over the years in these 3 different countries. And Adam will be speaking on reconciliation without acknowledgement in Mozambique, focusing on Mozambique and also focusing on some of the findings from his work and from his studies around this specific subject. And thank you to our panelists and welcome to our panelists as I have introduced them to us. And I would like also to welcome all of our participants to this webinar. I will start by maybe just pointing out a few housekeeping rules. We are also available on Facebook, streaming live on Facebook. You can also have access to us via Facebook. We are also recording this. We are using a webinar Zoom account. Therefore, we encourage all our participants to share their questions and answers and their comments in the Q&A section. You can also use our chat box for some comments, and we'll be checking our Q&A box, and we will be taking those questions, bringing them to the panel. And lastly, we have interpretation, both French and Arabic interpretation today. So please, depending on the language that is most comfortable for you, you are more than welcome to switch to the French channel or the Arabic channel, or to stay in the English channel. Translation is available. And if you are encountering any challenges, please write on the chat box. We have our IT and also CSVR members who will be more than willing to assist you with speed on any challenges that you may be facing. Please feel free to just WhatsApp us if you have our numbers, or to just write on the chat box, and we'll be more than happy to help you. As we commence with our panel for today, I just have 3 reflections, reflective observations from practice and the work that we are doing in Africa, and especially stemming from some of our contextual realities in Africa when we try and address or engage with collective trauma in post-conflict situations or in the aftermath of conflict. My first observation is around the fact that we have seen that conflicts do not leave societies or communities or even families or individuals the same. They always impact, they leave a dent, some impacts on our lives. This is irrespective of whether one is a direct victim of conflict or gross human rights violations, or an indirect victim, this does not matter whether one is a bystander witnessing, hearing about what has happened, or someone who gets told about what has happened. Either way, our lives are altered by an occurrence of conflict within a setting, be it a national setting, such as a society or a country, or a regional setting in one part of a country. So whether we like it or not, conflict will always leave us not the same. Our lives get altered by what we hear, what we experience, what we witness, what we are told, and what we encounter by association. And therefore the need to address collective trauma is important, and is not something that we can afford in the African context to postpone. Secondly, my observation is that when it comes to victims of gross human rights violations, and those that we perceive to be victims of trauma, for instance, there has been an overemphasis in our perception, human perception, that victims refer to those who have personally suffered, or those who have who are either indirect victims, in the sense that they have by extension also suffered from the suffering of direct victims. But we have not taken into account victims of trauma also coming from these two groups of people. Firstly, from perpetrators themselves, who also may suffer because of what they would have done, being haunted by some of the atrocities that they may have committed, for instance. And the second group is, especially within the context of Southern Africa, where most countries are had to engage in liberation struggles, we have not considered our leaders who fought in the liberation wars, who are currently liberation stalwarts, liberation struggle stalwarts. We have not considered them as victims of trauma. What we have done in our experiences, we have heroized them, we have sang their praises, we have named streets, we have named buildings after them, we have put them in office as leaders of society, leaders of governments, for instance. And when they are leading us from a position of their trauma, from a position of unresolved trauma, what Nomfundo, our executive director at CSVR, calls wounded leadership. So we continue to heroize them. We never consider that they could also be victims of trauma, and they need to deal with their trauma. Even themselves, when they look at themselves, when you try to address the fact that they may be traumatized by what they saw, what they did, what they experienced, most of them have lost some of their partners, members, colleagues in the bushes, for instance. These still continue to haunt them, for instance, but we never consider them as victims. And therefore the brokenness in society really stems from a number of occurrences. And lastly, my reflective observation is that when in the aftermath of conflict, there is a tendency by governments, by a number of sectors in society, including religious groups, including traditional leaders, government officials, even transitional justice or peace building practitioners, to try and move forward, where we try and frog-march everyone to move forward without dealing with the trauma that the nation, the communities, the families, and individuals would have experienced, for instance. And we tend to use some words such as let bygones be bygones. We use such words as let's forgive and forget, let's build forward, let's not focus on the past. What has happened, there's nothing we can do, but we need to build, we need to rebuild, we need to go forward, we need to move forward as a country, as a nation. We need to ensure that everyone has access to human rights, everyone has access to services, opportunities, and so forth. Therefore, we tend to build upon the debris of brokenness. We tend to build on the foundation of people's pain, their pain, their suffering, and their hate, without really considering the fact that when the cracks start to occur, then when eruption happens, the cycles of conflict, the recurrence of conflicts, the recurrence of violence that we often see in a number of African societies is really because of the things, the unresolved trauma that we refuse to deal with, or we were not ready to deal with at the time when some semblance of peace came into being. But we are also, as practitioners, and this is also the purpose of today's webinar, we are increasingly seeing the era of actually frog marching everyone towards peace, towards healing, towards rebuilding, towards contributing as citizens to the positive development of a country without resolving the trauma of the past, without dealing with some of the excesses and the traumatic experiences, how we're affected by our past, what happened either to us or to people we know, or what we heard, or what happened in our communities, even in instances where we're not direct victims. Therefore, we are, as practitioners, CSVR, and a number of organizations represented here, either through participants or through panelists, are increasingly calling for addressing collective trauma, the trauma of collectives suffered by collectives, whether direct or indirect victims, or even those on the periphery of victimhood, for instance, in order to move forward and establish peace that is sustainable and that is long-lasting. And with us today, our panelists will be sharing some insights, some reflections, some findings, and some of their own personal experiences with this particular subject of addressing or engaging trauma, collective trauma, in the aftermath of conflict in Africa. What does it look like? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the opportunities? And what are some of the residual issues that we still need to contend with and confront in order to effectively deal and address collective trauma in the aftermath of conflict? We will start from our list of panelists with Angie Yoda, who will be sharing some insights and some reflections from the work that she's doing in Nairobi, Kenya. Angie, over to you.
Did we have the short video?
Yes, Angie, I'm going to play that now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
When a community experiences conflict, the residual trauma impacts various levels of society. Violence that emerges from conflicting ideologies, cultures, and socio-political agendas tend to leave an aftertaste long after the conflict has ended. These devastating events have a traumatic impact on each of us as individuals. More devastating is the collective trauma that is as a result of whole groups of people, tribes and nations experiencing the brutality of violence over extended periods of time. The shadow of collective trauma post-conflict darkens important factors such as trust, hope, and faith in humanity that individuals and societies need in order to survive and heal. Collective trauma may give rise to significant shifts in the way people feel, think, behave, and relate with each other, thus fragmenting the very fabric of society. Families, communities, and political structures all bear the scars of difference and discord. They form part of the narrative, the lived experiences of those who stood and those who fell, and those who oppressed, knowingly or unknowingly. Conflict is complex because who knows where exactly it started when the ripples are as debilitating as the initial impact. Over time, these shifts become embedded in the culture of a people. For families and communities, this legacy becomes the fractured foundations upon which they are built. For individuals, they are expressed as behavior, personalities, and characteristics. All of these maladaptive traits are passed down generational lines. Some call them family curses or transgenerational transmissions of trauma, and too often in the African experience, they remain unhealed. The reality of life after these shifts is often an embodiment of violence and trauma, which leaves scattered beings searching for links and meaning. Lines are drawn during conflict, which often are hard to identify or erase post-conflict, process that has the potential to re-traumatize. The reality is that societies are left with shells and scars that remind them of what was lost, also what was overcome. The search for meaning in the African context is disrupted and never complete when faced with constant threat and instability. As the trauma is experienced collectively, we cannot ignore that the healing needs to be communal. We need to be able to deconstruct the maladaptive ways of being in order to reach a deeper healing that transcends generations past and generations to come. As displaced individuals, are we able to acknowledge the loss and resilience that was cultivated in survival? Are we able to hold accountable the systems that perpetuate the violence that has been adopted and enacted by people who often look and sound just like us? How do we begin to heal together when we have been separated in such a brutal manner and reunited to reconcile under hostile and unfamiliar circumstances? How can we look to the systems that perpetrated the violence to heal us when they too have not yet been fully reformed?
Thank you, Sumaya, for the powerful video. Angie, over to you.
Get off of mute. Sorry, I didn't know how to get off of mute. Good afternoon. I'm happy to present to you my research from my dissertation that I've actually just finished. I'd like to start with a short analogy. Take a look at this cup. Imagine that this cup represents the community that we've just seen in the video. Like the community, this cup is broken and cracked. What happens when I pour water into this cup that is cracked? It naturally leaks. The community cannot use the water because it's leaking and it's spilling out. This is how chronic violence impacts our communities. It appears as cracks. Think about your own community. What type of cracks do they have? In my community here in Kenya, we have cracks from colonialism, corruption, winner takes all politics, bad governance, plus we have issues tied to violent crime, violent extremism, and ethnic violence every 5 years during our elections. In Kenya, donors have spent billions of dollars tending to our cracks. And yet after 15 years of being here in Kenya, I think the cracks are bigger today than when I first came, even with all this outside aid. Why is this? I believe it has to do with the deep intergenerational, cultural, social, and political trauma that comes with our cracks. I'm not saying that trauma has not caused the cracks. Instead, violence, injustice, inequality are the causes of our cracks, but trauma has made it near impossible for us to repair our cracks in our cups. As Dr. Christina Bethel at the 2019 Collective Trauma Summit said, and I quote, "We're living in a trauma-organized society." However, after all the billion is spent, one thing that we know is that outsiders will never repair our cracks. That difficult task belongs to us. Only the community itself can repair its own cracks. And this is why healing our trauma is so important and a missing component of our many interventions. But wait, you say, the concept of trauma is from outsiders, predominantly Westerners. So many countries in the global South have been skeptical as they've seen the field of psychiatry and psychology neglecting our local knowledge and practices, thus leading to misguided assumptions and problematic treatments, and often even deeper cracks. The three mainstream options that I looked at in my dissertation were, the first one was the mental health approach, the second was the psychosocial approach, and the other option was to completely ignore the issue and pretend that it didn't exist. Peace-building practitioners from conflict-affected areas have historically acknowledged social, political, and economic conditions, which included colonialism and slavery, as taking center stage in the mental health issues and general well-being. As a result, programs in the Global South have continued to acknowledge that work on changing these conditions must be a part of peace building, but also mental health interventions. Without this framing, the investments in our communities will just lead to more leaking water. As a peace-building practitioner of many decades, I have seen that when a healing-centered approach is used, other initiatives work better, including dialogue work, violence prevention, development initiatives, and good governance. Now take a look at my cup. Let me find my cup. What do you see now? My cup is now repaired. And when I pour water in it, it holds. I can now use the water as I wish. I can take a sip. I can share it with my neighbors. I can water my garden or even take a bath. Healing comes with the ability to access choice, see choice, and I believe this is similar when a community begins to own their own healing processes. It gives people and communities new choices. Choices that they didn't have when everything was controlled by outsiders and their community cup was leaking. For the remaining of my time, I'm going to explain my systems map that I developed, give a short overview of my findings, and a few key recommendations from my research. Early on in my studies, as I started my process to frame my practice of the last 25 years, I started with a systems map. In today's presentation, I'm going to use this map to give a short overview of the three mainstream responses that I talked about in my earlier introduction. Trauma and pain afflict not only individuals. When they become widespread and ongoing, they affect entire communities, even countries as a whole. The implications of chronic violence have serious implications for people's health, the resilience of our country's social fabric, the success of development schemes, even the hope of future generations. In the late 1990s, when I first started to understand and follow this work, a lady named Martha Cabra in Nicaragua traveled to the worst affected areas with the goal of better understanding the psychological health of post-conflict, but also post-conflict Hurricane Mitch. What the team discovered was surprising. They found high levels of apathy, isolation, aggression, abuse, chronic somatic illness, as well as low levels of flexibility, tolerance, and the ability to trust and work together. Nicaragua, she said, was a multiply wounded, multiply traumatized, multiply mourning country. And she even went further to say, it's hard to move forward, to build democracy when personal and communal history still hurts. This describes many of the places on the African continent today, I think. The first approach I looked at was the traditional mental health approach. It's an approach used by specialized health NGOs, governments, the WHO. Overall, there's usually a very limited amount of funding, limited national capacity, even limited infrastructure for many of these programs in the post-conflict or in conflict-affected regions. Western-style mental health services are primarily used during the humanitarian intervention period and usually scaled down in this post-conflict stage when the initial post-conflict boom ends and funding for such programs wane. The most common approach, of course, is the psychosocial support approach. This is approach used by many people, UN, NGOs, primarily in the humanitarian phase during and immediately after conflict. It's regulated by established norms and frameworks like the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergencies. And while psychosocial support interventions are important, they're more often than not address the symptoms and not those underlying root causes of trauma that Anna spoke of as she gave us our introduction, the social injustice, marginalization, and the issues of chronic violence. The way psychosocial support interventions are developed in the humanitarian space, as I've experienced them as a practitioner, are usually not sustainable after the initial emergency funding ends. Often in the post-conflict period, when the focus transitions to reconciliation, institutional building, and governance, psychosocial supports are no longer possible because they're just not there. And yet this is when social healing is most required. In my literature review, I found that the approach fails to make that link between the psychosocial support and larger stabilization interventions that are often needed to support larger recovery. The final reapproach is actually a non-approach, and I'll bet everyone on this call has seen it. It's called the ignore it approach. This non-approach includes people working in environments in conflict or emerging from conflict. It includes a wide variety of actors, including the donors, the UN, multilaterals, international, national civil society, but also host government, even security actors like national and international police and the military. The lack of engagement in these issues show that the policy, as there's no major international donor, UN agency, or national government that's established a clear set of guidelines for obtaining the financial resources for establishing and sustaining culturally effective social healing activities after conflict or war. Violence affects populations, even though we know up to 80% of the conflict-affected population may be impacted. And I want to just put a little caveat. DFID is working on this. They have something that they were rolling out at the end of last year. However, it's still not being used in any country so far. This is the example of the first systems map that I developed in June 2017 as I started my research project. I'm sorry I don't have time to tell you about my literature review and my grounded theory methodology. I interviewed over 30 practitioners from around the world. Some of you are on this call, but due to time constraints, let me turn your attention to the finding of my research. Healing-centered approach addresses the complexity of chronic violence. It recognizes that systems and structures which should be supportive of recovery are often as greatly damaged and broken by the same chronic violence. The three main stream approaches that I highlighted earlier, they don't sufficiently address the effects of and the impact of chronic violence. Thus, a new framework was necessary. Practitioners acclaimed that there was an alternative approach that existed in practice but was nameless. Existing interventions were primarily associated with the psychosocial approaches, but as peace builders, never really felt that we really were doing exactly psychosocial approaches, but we're doing something else. I'll now quickly give some highlights to the new healing-centered peace building approach. The first component of the approach is inclusion. And the three subcomponents include a multidisciplinary and multisectoral approach, role for lived experiences, and local and traditional leaders are included. Peace builder practitioners who work in chronic violence environments where nothing seems to work because of the complexity of the situation. Inclusion is usually our first casualty. As noted by one of my interviewees, the language which comes with the violence is a language of exclusion, of distortion, of belittling, of destroying self-esteem, and it has incredibly long legacy and links to psychological trauma. Rarely are psychologists or counselors present in many of these places that we're talking about, and if they are there, it's very unlikely that they speak the local languages, and yet we all understand and know we heal in our mother tongue. Communities may also be suspicious of outsiders. A South African practitioner noted to me that since there were not enough professional counselors, we all learned that we can hold safe spaces in order to start the healing process. Moreover, a psychologist peace builder noted that for her, she learned early on that we psychologists need to address much more than just the so-called mental health issues if we're going to be relevant. A psychologist peace builder from Kenya also said, and I quote her, "The biomedical approach is a narrow approach, focused on mental health expertise only. It doesn't address justice, development, or peace, when you need people with lived experiences to bring that to the table. Often lived experiences is the only long-term support available at the community level." One community activist in the US noted how in his neighborhood, which was had high poverty levels and was primarily African American, continues to have little access, but there still continues to be a great distrust of mental health professionals. Predominantly Western biomedical approach to mental health is based on professional expertise, which is often meant to replace the local healers in their more traditional roles. An interviewee from Kenya shared a story about how she's found there to be a Mama Anisa in every community. The Mama Anisa is the person that people call when there's a family or a community crisis. As mentioned above, there weren't enough counselors or trained social workers in the violence-prone communities that Mama Anisa worked in. And so people have to deal with these high level of distresses. They don't stop because there's nobody to help. The healing-centered peace-building approach works to identify and support hundreds of grassroots local healers, such as the Mama Anisas on the Kenyan coast. The Mama Anisas are accessible, they stay in the community for the long term, and they're already doing the work. How do you help support them and strengthen their already existing capacity? My second component is customization and contextualization. Community-informed, culturally adapted processes is the first subcomponent. The importance of storytelling, using a decolonializing approach, and utilizing community resources are the four subcomponents of this category. Culture adapts and changes, and it's not stagnant. Many of the interviewees noted that the majority of the mental health psychosocial programs were culturally inappropriate, expensive, relied on outside expertise, and weren't scalable. Often for this reason, peace builders didn't engage in such programs even when they could see such help was required. Because it was difficult to engage with the mental health psychosocial practitioners, many peace builders began to experiment on their own. One interviewee from Zimbabwe noted that as she started to experiment, the culture and context was critical for the healing-centered work, as it took the work beyond just being another NGO intervention. Another from Kenya noted that because we need this, it can't be developed by anyone but us. Rituals and stories encourage resilience through the development of meaning making. And it's been said, you can't hate people once you hear their stories. Often these stories are not time-barred and they become a critical part of the community's identity. One interviewee observed, sometimes when you listen to people talking, you think they mean about last week. They'll recount something they were not even present for that came down through their grandparents, even great-grandparents, as if it was last week. It's very alive. A key trait of colonialism is that it devalues indigenous people, their knowledge and cultures, while the healing-centered approach is intentional about integrating and utilizing indigenous healing practices. Peace-building activities are often targeted at post-colonial societies where structures and injustices are the underlying root causes to active and latent conflict. A Kenyan peace builder explained to me, colonialism isn't just the political colonialization, it was also the psychological colonialization. And when we got independence, we may have gotten political independence, but we didn't get the psychological independence. As peace builders, we're trained to develop projects, programs, have impact at the community level. But when have we been trained to focus on unraveling the tragic after effects of colonialization? Hopelessness and helplessness are common feelings expressed by communities in chronic violence. However, it was also noted that when people lead their own healing process and truly own it, two things happen. The first is that people have increased agency. And as the peace builder from Zimbabwe said, empowered people ask questions and make challenges. And secondly, the healing process is organic and healing. And in the words of a Kenyan peace builder, it becomes culturally adaptive through our language and our culture. The third component is, I think, one of the most critical parts of the framework. It's the breaking the cycles of violence. And there are two pieces: engaging with both victims and perpetrators, and also the development of agency. Trauma that's not transformed is transferred. People who have been hurt can at times justify the use of violence to seek justice. One interviewee who was involved in the healing-centered peace building for the last 25 years, she noted, the cycles of violence is a key component of combining the mental health profession, the trauma experience, and what happens within the peace building field. The healing-centered peace building approach acknowledges there's not often a clear distinction between victim and aggressor, and everyone affected by trauma should have access to a support system in order to break the cycles of violence. Within both the mental health psychosocial approaches, the focus is primarily on the victim and the survivor, and these are needed, but these approaches also leave those who hurt others isolated and prone to continuing the cycle of violence. One interviewee from Kenya put it, the perpetrator doesn't see the victim as someone who's going through pain and hurt. He only feels his own pain. A Kenyan peace builder also noted why investing in the healing process became so important to him. He shared how in 2007 and 2008, as we faced our crisis here, he found peace builders in Kenya had given up. The level of trauma and burnout was too much. Our peace builders had become powerless victims as well. Attitudes focused on hopelessness and powerlessness are characteristics of depression, and they stop people from engaging and finding solutions to their own problems. Healing will bring hope, and with that possibility brings new solutions. My fourth component is a systems thinking. There are four components. The approach is resilience informed, a foundation for development, justice, and governance, and includes collective healing approaches, which we're focusing on today, as well as promoting ecological healing. Several of the interviewees explained how the systems thinking is crucial to providing system orientation, to understanding the patterns within the newly named approach. An interviewee shared, resilience can't be built upon, and we're not slaves to our past. We are free to create a new future. And as long as we're able to frame the conversation around trauma in relationship to resilience, it has an extremely powerful way to approach in a healing conversation. If you remember the cracked cup from the beginning of my presentation, trauma negatively impacts the ability of people to constructively participate in peace and development. During the Global Trauma Summit, Dr. Christina Bethel, who I'd already talked about, her longer quote says, we're a society organized based on trauma. So we need to go from being trauma organized to being trauma informed, and eventually our goal is really to be healing centered. One psychologist I interviewed, who later became a peace builder in his later career, is a strong proponent of peer support groups. He noted, group work has the potential to impact justice. And while another interviewee noted space is critical, it's needed in those places where people can collectively make choices to change. Finally, an interviewee explained connection between the healing-centered work and the environment when he started out his interview by saying indigenous cultures knew that we were more than social beings, we were also ecological beings. And my last component is the trauma-informed tools, and there are four subcomponents. Relationships hold and transform space. Neuroscience is important to ground practice. Embodied practices regulate our nervous system. And arts-based interventions open creativity and intervention. When you say you're trauma-informed, it means you shift the focus from viewing trauma as a weakness, what's wrong with you, to what's happened to you, what have you experienced. As one interviewee from South Africa said, a trauma-informed support system is holistic. Another interviewee noted how structural and direct violence provides reason for developing trauma-informed workplaces, schools, community networks, even resilience-based programs. A Kenyan interviewee noted safe spaces and safe relationships are needed for this healing. While in the past decade, advancements in neuroscience have brought new understandings into the peace-building field. For people in communities in trauma, when we react with the fear response, whether the danger is real or it's perceived, it's something that has to be acknowledged. One interviewee emphasized trust is biological, not only an emotional response. Another posed the question, while we want people to be in that green zone, in the regulated social engagement zone, what happens if the people we're working with to do peace aren't there? How do we build peace in such a situation? Several interviewees talked about the link to the body to the brain, and one social activist and trauma healer in the US said, unprocessed trauma means parts of us are numb. And those parts of us that would know that we shouldn't try to engage with the parts of us that are unable to engage make our solutions really complicated. And I really love that quote. Interviewees emphasize that we have to be present, kind, listen. Listening is that opportunity for co-regulation, and it regulates our nervous system. If we feel distressed, having someone just listen or hold space for us calms our nervous systems. Finally, in closing, this approach uses an arts-based intervention to inspire new creativity and innovation. Expression through the arts supports Kenyan peace builder. A Kenyan peace builder noted the creation of safety and the ability to separate oneself from the horrifying experience of trauma without relying on words, which are often ineffective. This brings me to the close of my short overview of the healing-centered peace-building approach. I'd like to just finish, if I could, my conclusion, or am I over time?
You are over time, Angie, but maybe we can just give you 1 minute to conclude.
It'll take a little bit longer, but I was told I could have just a few extra minutes. So the including is that the healing-centered peace-building approach, it's a buzzword now in our world, but it's something that's really now starting to be a part of what we look at. The healing-centered approach addresses the complexity of chronic violence. It recognizes that systems and structures, which should be supportive of recovery, are often greatly damaged by the violence that are often unbroken. Healing-centered peace-building refers to the ways in which leaders, programs, and organizations mitigate the impact of violence, bring trauma awareness and knowledge, and skills to their organizational culture, practices, and policies. Here's one more look at the map. Finally, the big takeaways. The first is we have to start talking about social healing as a foundation to the other skills as peace builders. If we engage in it, peace works better, development's real, and government functions. Secondly, we must prepare peace builders to face trauma in their work, helping them develop embodied practices so that they can tap into them later when such practices are needed. And lastly, we all need to understand that the organizations we work in the peace building field are all impacted by the same violence and trauma. Helping peace builders understand how to work and lead healing-centered organizations will go a long ways to help them professionally and personally, but I also believe will transform our field. Today, it isn't a choice to ignore this work. The symptoms, if they're left unaddressed, will become not only mental illness, but will negatively impact our larger society. In order to do something about trauma, systems and organizations must change. It's no longer an option to ignore the issues. We must heal our cracks before we move forward, and healing is possible. And I'm sorry for going over.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you so much for sharing some of those findings from your research, really findings that are important for the work that we are doing, that are really grounded on reality and contextual issues emerging in Africa, what practitioners, what those working with community members, traumatized community members have also come up with, and also just sharing some of the reflections and some of the feedback from some of the people that you interviewed in your during your research is really powerful. And the analogy of a cup that is broken, that is leaking, is really powerful because it depicts in reality what happens when you keep expecting from a broken individual, from a broken community. You're expecting them to build, you're expecting them to be empowered, you're expecting them to contribute positively to the development and the peace of a country, of a community, when they have really almost nothing to give, because whatever is being poured in also quickly goes out. So we are expecting empty vessels in terms of peace, in terms of healing, to pour and to contribute positively. Again, thank you so much for that presentation. Without much further ado, we will now cross over to Fidi and Yvonne, who will be sharing with us on co-creating an integrated approach to MHPSS and peace building. One of the missing links in peace building, for instance, for the longest time has been the MHPSS component, and even in transitional justice as well, which is really important when we are working in the aftermath of conflict, when we are trying to rebuild and address the consequences of violence, violations, victimhood, and suffering. The MHPSS component for the longest time has not been considered. So again, Fidi and Yvonne, your contributions, we are more than excited to actually hear from you on how we can co-create this integrated approach. Over to you both.
Thank you so much. Anna, can you see me? Because I can't see
you see your screen.
You can see my screen.
Yes.
Just wondering whether, okay, great. And Yvonne should have her camera on as well, because this is very much a shared presentation. Thanks, Anna, so much for facilitating this important discussion today. And thanks also to the rest of your team at CSVR for putting this important webinar series together at a time when I think we really need to be talking about MHPSS. And the one thing I think that is positive that has come out of COVID is that it's really put a spotlight on mental health and psychosocial support, not just within the peace building and transitional justice field, but beyond that. So I will be sharing some findings from exploratory work conducted in South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe on co-creating an integrated approach to MHPSS and peace building. And it was quite important for us to say findings from exploratory work, because as much as this is also research, we're very much at the beginning of bringing together these fields and understanding what it would take to create an integrated approach. And I'd also like to acknowledge that there are lots of people on this call who are friends and colleagues who have participated, who've inspired, colleagues from IJR and colleagues from CSVR and other organizations across the continent who really contributed to our thinking in this field. Now, right, there we go. So just a little bit of background on this work and where it's come from. So IJR has been working on narrowing the gap between MHPSS and peace building for the last 5 years or so. And I think it's important to add that as an organization that is now 20 years old, we hadn't up until then overtly addressed this issue, which I think is quite interesting. I think the presentation that, or rather the video that you screened at the beginning, Anna, was quite a sobering reminder. I mean, we are reminded of the violence and the legacy of violence in South Africa every day, but seeing those images, I think was really sort of, it really hit me quite hard that these are the memories that we live with in South Africa, that many people have and are still very raw and play quite a key role in the way we live amongst one another and with ourselves. So for me, that is quite interesting that we didn't have programs overtly dealing with mental health and psychosocial support. We had projects related more broadly to it, but they happened quite extensively in isolation, I think, of the broader sort of peace building and transitional justice realm. I think it's important to add that what we found so far is that there are significant overlaps between the two fields, but they work mostly in isolation from one another. And I'll talk a little bit about those overlaps later on. We've used a variety of methodologies in recent years to begin to build an evidence base that we need a collaborative approach. And I think Angie has spoken at length about why it's so important that we link the two fields. They are absolutely dependent on one another in order to generate sustainable outcomes for themselves. We've conducted a mapping study, a literature review. I think these are documents many of you are familiar with, that you've also participated in writing up. And the findings suggest that while MHPSS and peacebuilding organizations recognize one another as necessary and complementary actors, there is very little understanding of one another and very little really deep coordination and collaboration. And again, I'll speak about that later. I'm going to hand over to Yvonne. This is a photo of one of our co-creation workshops in Kenya. And over to you, Yvonne. Can't hear you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Frederique, and Marianne is also on here as part of our team. I'm going to talk about the intended objectives here, and it's already been implied by everything that has been said before. I agree that initial video was really, especially many of the scenes, it comes from all over Africa, but there were so many reminders of the timeline and how that unfolds and real lives are involved, and for a very long time. So we wanted to acknowledge that in this co-creation, it's not going to be an individual that's going to make a difference. It's not going to be the people that sign the peace agreements in far removed offices where what we refer to as strengthening the social fabric, which is just another metaphor to the cracked cup, that will pay attention to that. It's not going to be a single organization. So for us coming in from two different disciplines, we really thought that it's being together, and what we haven't looked at yet, we've looked at good community-based interventions, we've looked at the more national interventions, but we haven't really looked at how organizations can come together from the different fields, who both acknowledge that having the other field in their organization as part of their mandate would make a difference to how they deliver their programs. So the organizations involved were either MHPSS, who had recognized that peace building is important, or peace builders who had recognized that MHPSS and healing is important, or maybe other grassroots organizations who have identified both of these areas as becoming barriers to achieving other objectives in their programs. So it's really from that kind of sense, although we look at an ecological approach, we are seeing the intervention as being co-created by different organizations being in strong a dialogue with each other. But underpinning that is the sense of a collective responsibility for joint action. That is really what we're looking at. Even when people start now taking this up in language, when organizations and other stakeholders are recognizing the importance of this work, is how is it really going to happen? How are we going to move from where we are at to where we want to go to? When we know what the intentions are, how are we going to walk that talk? And it can't be facilitated by outsiders, but creating a space that maybe comes from deciding that this joint reflection needs to happen would be absolutely crucial to stimulate that dialogue, because the people we are talking about are overstretched, are really have great difficulty with not enough resources to achieve what their mandates are to set out to achieve. So how is this going to really take place? And it's going to vary from context to context. It's going to depend on whether people can step into creating a place within that particular country of how it will be carried forward. We didn't know how that was going to be. So people had to share their theoretical frameworks, their practical toolkits, what other things they have already got in how they're going to step forward. An example would be also seeing that although we may speak the same language and we may have the same goals, we don't go about it, and our understanding of a concept may be different. So assessments, for instance, done by peace builders is very different to an MHBSS person making an assessment. How can we exchange that and see how it differs? The same for advocacy. The MHBSS people perceive that peace builders have access to advocacy and lobbying in a different way, and the MHBSS people may think that they start off with a community level and then end up to be with families and individuals. So joining these angles, joining this way forward would make great sense for people. We also speak about this this idea of breaking cycles of violence, because we can see how that disrupts all of these processes, and it comes from a very real place. So the co-creation in this case is doing the think tank and trying to find a way forward. If you can go to the next slide, please, Farid. It's very much a generative process where we try and stay very close to the story that people are telling, what is working, what is not working, what ideas come forward, what practices are people involved in that have just not been highlighted in their work, maybe because the organization becomes very structured and these indigenous knowledge systems that are used by everybody isn't written in the same way. How can we hear how that is happening? So when people are brought together in the space for the first time, there may be perceptions of each other from each other's organizations, from the work that people do, that already needs to be addressed from the onset. So we try to track energy and listening as part of our trust building process very, very mindfully. Asking a question like, why are people in the room this particular day? What brought them to this work? And many of the people within the national context working in these organizations would have been part of that story of disruption and conflict and where trauma was involved. We don't talk in trauma in the same way as people all respond to trauma differently. And we like to think that we're ultimately going towards where we get an understanding that there can't be peace if there's no peace of mind. So putting these agendas out, creating exercises where people hear each other's stories, where the humanness of people becomes visible, that is what generates that process. And you've got it kind of develops as the coming together develops. So we bring people together from these different fields for a few days, and we see what comes out and try and create a plan that people can, based on their case stories that they are sharing with us, where they speak from a position of knowing as well, what can be generated and how is that going to be sustained in the future. We haven't got to the answers, and Frederic will speak to that a bit later on, and we have some follow-up steps that we're doing. But our process very much got undermined through the COVID-19 epidemic. We couldn't do the face-to-face work that we really wanted to. We had a strong feeling that to do this online was not going to be the same, even for people living within the country, not being able to see and meet each other had a big impact. At the same time, we were really aware that conflicts continue, all these ways of the way people have been impacted is still there. So the work has to carry on. We try and find ways of doing some of that more online, but we definitely need the face-to-face position. So we're looking at, through this process, at individual, kind of just getting an understanding of what is the importance of that process, where we look all the time at a more real in-depth understanding as things evolve. How does power operate? Where are people wanting to go to in terms of their value and identity? What kind of agency is present either within an organization, within a community, within individuals, even proxy agency? And what are these things that are getting in the way of doing what people want to do, where they feel they're kind of jeopardizing themselves? They're not walking the talk in the same way. The people say it's easy to say what needs to be done, but it's very hard to do it. And that is a real ongoing struggle. So we need what some of the things that Angie is talking about, the hope that we are going to be able to get to a different future where there is a stronger fabric, where we can move on. But how do we do that? Over to you, Frederic, for the findings. You're still muted. Frederic, you're still muted.
Sorry, gosh, after a year of Zoom, you'd think that would go faster. I wanted to pay tribute to Undine on the table at one of our co-creation workshops, because I see she's on the call. We just wanted, I think, to illustrate that there's also levity and lightness, despite the many heavy conversations that we have when we do this work. Here are a few more images of the work that we've done in Kenya. Angie participated in that workshop as well. Yeah, in terms of findings, and I realize we have only 5 minutes left, sort of a few commonalities that we've been able to draw out of these 3 to 4 day co-creation workshops, which we've now hosted in South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. So we have found that stereotypes and assumptions prevent deep engagement between the fields. We think we know one another, but we don't actually. And there are a number of fairly sort of legitimate, of course, but complex stereotypes that prevent that. One of the most interesting ones to me is the notion that MHPSS practitioners see peace building as being political. And thus collaboration would potentially jeopardize the neutrality of their work. But there are many others that I don't have the time to go into now. To work together, the fields have to really get to know one another. So so this is really the work that we did when we sat together, is how much do peace builders know about MHPSS practitioners? Where does it begin? Where does it end? How do they define the work that the other does? And I think going forward, this is something we really need to do. We need to develop a proper professional, and I think also sort of emotional rapprochement between the fields as allies, rather than as potential obstructions, so to speak, to our work, or even competitors. So in the co-creation workshops, we really had sort of conversations about what is peace building? How do we as peace builders define our work to MHPSS practitioners, and vice versa? And beyond that, you know, what are the acronyms that we use, the concepts? To what extent do we agree on whether or not, to what extent do we agree that the concepts have one definition? Can we agree on one definition going forward? And certainly what Yvonne was mentioning earlier on with regards to assessment, I think is an interesting one, plays a central role in MHPSS, less so in peace building. Peace builders do conflict analysis, do conflict mapping. It's quite similar, and yet if we're going to work together, we may need to find commonalities. What are the goals and objectives of one another's field? What are we really trying to achieve? And again, context, and I'm pleased that that's come so strongly out of Angie's presentation as well. Cultural and traditional norms of each context must be at the forefront of integration. We found that these structures, norms, and realities play such an important role, both in the peace building and in the MHPSS field, that to develop one approach, one integrated approach for all countries around the world, I think is a near impossibility. We may be able to develop sort of a normative framework, but beyond that, that is going to have to be adapted to particular contexts, because there are such beautiful richnesses in each context that we really need to integrate and build on, and also understand, and in some cases I think even reinvigorate. I think of sitting in many peace building sessions in South Sudan and people saying, you know, conflict has destroyed so many of the traditional structures that we're familiar with here, so many of the oral traditions, the cultures, the songs. Can we reinvigorate those as part of a psychosocial and peace building process? And of course, government and donors both play a really, really important role. So the extent to which both of them endorse, support, and in a sense role play good MHPSS and good peace building, both in the sense of donors in terms of funding this work, but the sort of, the go ahead, the green light that is given by governments to this work, and to MHPSS in particular, because on the African continent in particular is still so heavily stigmatized. All of that needs to be taken into consideration, and ideally, and I think this is something we need to take very seriously going forward, both governments and donors need to be taken into consideration. I'm running behind time. There is an assumption that when we refer as peace builders to the MHPSS field, that is collaboration, but what we actually found is that a lot of us don't know what happens behind the referral door. And this was something that came out very strongly in Zimbabwe, where there was the sense of, oh, but we refer our participants to psychologists, to social workers, to community mental health programs. But when we asked and dug a little bit deeper about what that referral process entailed, there was fairly little understanding. What is exciting, I think, is that there is a substantive base of commonalities which can be used as a foundation for integration. So firstly, both fields are founded on a relational approach. And by a relational approach, I think we mean building mutually satisfying relationships as a basis for emotional well-being. Both fields thus aim to strengthen social fabric. There is a reliance on indigenous knowledge systems by both fields, but somewhat different indigenous knowledge systems, which can be a source of immense richness for the other. So as peace builders, we may work with elders, with religious councils, with community traditional leadership structures, which in turn might play a very, very important role for the work that MHPSS practitioners might do, and vice versa. Understanding those indigenous knowledge systems in each context is really important. And then again, the issue of the assessment. So in the MHPSS field, it starts with the 4 W's, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is who's doing what, where, and when. And then us as peace builders, we start our work with a conflict mapping and an analysis. And it really is, there's a lot of overlap. And wouldn't it be really exciting when in future post-conflict interventions start with an integrative system where both MHPSS and peace building needs are addressed through some kind of a conflict analysis or a conflict assessment. And then something quite interesting, which is that accountability issue, that many MHPSS professions operate within regulatory frameworks and have professional bodies which ensure that there is accountability and that there isn't sort of misconduct. this is not something that peace building has. We can go out and do our work, and there's not really anywhere where we can go to hold those peace builders accountable who may be going against the do no harm principle. So how can we as peace builders learn from the MHPSS field there? Then very briefly, the next steps. So developing the emerging, what we call psychosocial peace building field will require innovation and collective action through identified stakeholders, as well as a sustainable platform to hold the work. And I think what we've been trying to do through the co-creation workshops, through our own expert group at IJR, and through the networking that we are continually doing is trying to build that platform. It's not necessarily a singular platform. It's the lobbying and the advocacy that we all do in our work to bring the fields together. But we need to create space and time for the fields to meet, to exchange, and to learn from one another. And I think COVID really isn't our friend in that regard, because what we do need are conferences and workshops and trainings for us to physically come together and to learn from one another over a protected period of time. Strong partnerships are necessary for joint lobbying and advocacy of governments, donors, and policymakers on the urgency of linking the fields. And I think something really exciting happened at the end of last year, not I think, I know. There was a big effort led by the Dutch government to lobby the United Nations Secretary General's Peace Building Architecture Review to include MHPSS as critical to peace building. And that review process was successful, and the Peace Building Architecture Review that was published at the end of last year now includes only a sentence, but we're getting there, it's baby steps, on this important link. And I think that's the kind of work that we need to be doing at many different levels. So IJR is a relatively small organization based in Cape Town in South Africa, but we were part of that process. I know CSVR is involved with the African Union, with transitional justice processes on the continent. And all of that contributes to making this work more visible. There needs to be training and awareness raising of practitioners from both fields. Just earlier on, I wrote an email to somebody inviting them to a co-creation workshop, somebody who hadn't participated in them previously. And the response was, but I am not an MHPSS expert. And my next email is going to be explaining that it doesn't require experts, quite the contrary, it requires a curiosity and an acknowledgement that the two fields need to be brought together in order for us to do this work. And this is a joint learning and as we've said, co-creation process. So finally, yeah, COVID-19, it's a challenge. How do we respond to the massive mental health and psychosocial needs that we're seeing all around us? And I do think that COVID has put a spotlight on that. So I also think there's an opportunity. I think that international organizations like the World Health Organization and others have hosted many meetings, webinars. There's really been a lot of advisory being issued on how important mental health and psychosocial support is during this pandemic, and that we need to harness in order to link MHPSS and peace building further. So I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fidi and Yvonne, for yet another enlightening presentation, especially on how we can co-create an integrated approach to peace building and MHPSS. And again, you have outlined to us how the two fields are complementary, especially when it comes to addressing some of the minute, the micro level harms committed, and also the experiences, the trauma experienced by communities, and again buttressing and fitting onto the presentation by Angie earlier around the need for us to really address the trauma and the suffering and of the collectives at that level, at a community level, honoring again some of the indigenous approaches to healing, honoring also what already exists on the ground, and building upon some of those blocks towards ensuring that the peace building goals that we seek to achieve as practitioners are long lasting, and also that they actually achieve the objectives that they intended to, and do not do more harm in the process. Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Fidi, for that presentation. Now we cross over to Adam Kochansky, who will be specifically sharing with us some of the work that he's done, specifically focusing on Mozambique, where reconciliation without acknowledgement in Mozambique, what some of the impacts of that reconciliation without acknowledgement have resulted in over the years in that country. Adam, over to you.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone, at least here from Montreal, Canada. I wanted just quickly to take a moment to thank the CSVR for putting on this really important event and bringing so many great speakers together to talk about this topic of collective trauma. So my presentation is based on a chapter from a larger book project that's forthcoming called Framing Atrocity, the Politics of Truth in Local Transitional Justice. And the book deals with the so-called local turn in TJ, which rejects top-down one-size-fits-all international templates for more localized responses. While I was initially optimistic about this turn toward the local, with time I realized that it had some of its own limitations, especially in dealing with issues of collective trauma. The book questions some of the dominant assumptions about the local, and it describes how in some cases they can be used paradoxically to undermine rather than deliver the truth and justice that transitional justice processes seek. In drawing on several months of field research in Mozambique, which included over 40 semi-structured interviews, archival research, and also observations in communities, the book shows how TJ responses at all levels can be subverted, including locally. It calls attention in particular to the importance of framing and discourse. And I'll be arguing in this presentation that framing is inherent in all transitional justice processes. And framing is a sociological term that refers to schemata of interpretation that guide people in processing and understanding events in their everyday lives and in the world more generally, such as the causes and consequences of a civil war. So I'm going to start with a very brief background of the conflict. And after that, I'm going to shift to my argument and talk about how, based on my research, the Mozambican conflict was framed and the reasons for that. And then after that, I'm going to do a deeper dive on the local mechanisms that were used in the Mozambican context and discuss some of the limitations. And at the very end, I'll wrap up with a few concluding remarks from my research. So Mozambique was under Portuguese rule until 1975, when the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, or FRELIMO, gained independence for the country and formed the first post-independence government. Following a period of Marxist reforms that included some violence, the resulting peace was tenuous, as Ian Smith's white minority regime in Rhodesia began covertly recruiting, training, and arming dissidents and expatriates to form the Mozambican National Resistance, or RENAMO. And RENAMO was formed initially in order to destabilize the FRELIMO government, which was sponsoring Black nationalist groups in Rhodesia, but also in South Africa as well. So at the outset, RENAMO received funding and equipment from Rhodesian intelligence services, which was later picked up by the South African apartheid regime. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries, they also sustained the other side, so the government, for most of the conflict until it renounced its ideological leanings in the late 1980s in favor of capitalism following the death of President Samora Machel in a plane crash in 1986. But there was also a very important internal dimension to the conflict, which began to emerge in the early 1980s, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I go on in this presentation. So the war between Renamo and Frelimo lasted for 16 years, at least the initial conflict, and resulted in over 1 million deaths and some 5 million refugees and internally displaced persons. Millions of landmines were laid over the course of the conflict, and here we have a humanitarian deminers demining those landmines in this picture. And these landmines slowed the development and of the country following the war and caused injuries and fatalities long after the fighting had ended. Although not always recognized by the scholarly literature, as I was mentioning, there is evidence suggesting both sides are responsible for having perpetrated war crimes and crimes against humanity. Both Renamo and Frelimo recruited child soldiers over the course of the conflict into their ranks and are suspected of having committed acts of sexual violence, including rape and other forms of SGBV. Renamo was particularly brutal in its methods, often disfiguring its victims by mutilating ears, noses, and lips, a gruesome tactic that later gained notoriety during the Lord's Resistance Army's conflict in northern Uganda. Meanwhile, Frelimo, for its part, also allegedly is responsible for various atrocities, having employed napalm and scorched earth tactics against civilians in Renamo's stronghold areas, as well as a number of other types of atrocities. So we have a picture here of traumas that stem from actions from both sides. So throughout the conflict, there were several efforts to bring the two sides together in order to reach a peaceful settlement, but they proved rather unfruitful until 1990, after both sides had lost much of their external support with some of the geopolitical shifts that happened with the end of the Cold War. The talks between the Frelimo government and Rome unfolded over a 2-year span in Rome, Italy. And here we have a picture of the final handshake agreement in Rome, and were mediated by the Italian government and a Catholic lay organization, the Community of Sant'Egidio. The negotiations finally yielded a peace agreement, ending the war on the 4th of October, 1992. So this agreement, so the Rome Agreement, called for a deployment of a peace-building mission, the UN operation in Mozambique, or ONUMOS, which was tasked with overseeing multi-party elections, and there was a strong focus on the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. Notably, for a war that produced 1 million fatalities, the General Peace Agreement did not comprise any provisions for transitional justice. To the contrary, the National Amnesty passed in a blanket amnesty law only 10 days later, granting immunity to all sides of this conflict. So while Mozambique has often been cited as one of peacebuilding's lone success stories, and an example when chosen amnesia works as a response to dealing with collective trauma, I contend that public reluctance to speak about wartime atrocities above all reflects a state-imposed directive to cover the abusive past that happened on all sides and to not discuss it openly. And that it is this that shapes and limits some of the local transitional justice responses that took place on the ground. Specifically, in the chapter of the book, I argue that the ruling party, the government, has been able to successfully frame the civil war as one that was triggered by external forces. And there are 3 elements of this discursive frame. First, it identifies a primary cause of the conflict, so the aggressive actions of Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa, a main effect, which was the creation of a rebel group, Renamo, and some principal solutions, namely a transitional justice policy focused on selective amnesia and a focus on DDR, so disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. This dominant narrative deliberately and strategically omits, and this came out through some of the interviews that I did, the internal sources of the conflict. In so doing, it casts Renamo largely as the sole perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and it reinforces the government's, so Frelimo's, claims to legitimacy as liberators of Mozambique from Portuguese colonial administration. I'll explain a little bit later in the presentation how this dominant narrative has shaped and limited local efforts on the ground. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the local turn in transitional justice. So with the amnesty, the blanket amnesty that was passed several days after the Rome Agreement, transitional justice was largely left to the local population and communities to do themselves. So the government didn't have a role in this, but it did kind of co-opt it in the sense that these mechanisms were later praised as being a justification for why, say, trials or a truth commission or reparations were not delivered. Joaquim Chissano, the president at the time, stated that Mozambicans are doing justice the Mozambican way. So these local efforts in Mozambique, they later became recognized as some of the earliest examples in the literature of what has become the local turn in transitional justice. Prompted by the alienating and top-down direction and discourse of international-led transitional justice efforts at the time, especially those regarding war crimes and crimes against humanity in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. These approaches, so local approaches, emphasize local level knowledge and initiative, centering above all the needs and the demands of survivors. I want to be clear that when I'm referring to the local, I'm not talking about national level approaches. I'm often referring to initiatives that were either initiated by NGOs or by the communities themselves. And these are processes that are occurring at the local, so the district, commune, or village levels. And they have a participatory element in the sense that they engage the actual communities themselves. While the local was greeted initially with enthusiasm by transitional justice scholars and practitioners, I argue in the book that some of the same limitations that have plagued international and state level transitional processes, namely how they can be politicized and instrumentalized, have plagued local efforts as well. And it is these subtle and unseen power dimensions in politics and local methods that play out and shape them. And that's what the focus of my analysis is. So let's talk a little bit about some of the local approaches that were used in Mozambique following the Rome agreements. So contrary to popular belief, where it's oftentimes mentioned that Mozambicans simply moved on and forgot the past, there's actually been a wide variety of different types of local responses that were employed. These range from psychosocial reintegration and healing ceremonies for child soldiers and other ex-combatants, or for survivors of sexual and gender-based crimes, to the use of traditional courts to adjudicate different types of crimes, to various memorialization initiatives as well, especially in the south of the country. So in terms of the dynamics of the Mozambican Civil War, it's important to note that it was a very diffuse and scattered conflict, especially in the initial years. Oftentimes there were roving groups, smaller groups of either rebels or military personnel who were moving throughout the country. And the types of killings that took place tended to be on more of a smaller scale. However, as the conflict expanded into the south in the late 1980s, and Renamo moved into some of the traditional government stronghold areas, this is when some of the massacres proliferated. And it is in these southern parts and southern communities where there have been various efforts to memorialize the past. The best known massacre from the time is one in a village called Homoini in Nyambane province, where there is a memorial that has been set up to commemorate the over 400 victims who lost their lives on that day. But these types of memorials have also been erected in several other communities, some of them being larger cement type structures and others being more informal. But this is important to know that Mozambicans, they do want to confront their collective trauma in some way and not to simply bury the past and move forward from it, as is often discussed and assumed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the shortcomings of these local approaches. The most obvious one being the resumption of hostilities in Mozambique in 2012, where Renamo, so to speak, came out of the bush, rearmed, and carried out a low-level insurgency against the government for several years leading up to the 2014 elections. So above all, what's important to note with regards to some of the local processes that played out in the 1990s is that they were shaped and constrained by this dominant conflict frame that I mentioned before. Civilians on the ground were very acutely aware of the boundaries that existed in their communities about what constituted appropriate versus inappropriate discourse about conflict-related events. Very importantly, there would be no ascribing blame to either sides, talking about various abuses that were carried out in the terms of this was done by Frelimo or this was done by Renamo, or ascribing any sort of individual accountability at the community level as well. And this was very clear in some of the psychosocial reintegration and healing ceremonies. But it also limited some of the traditional court proceedings, where some of the victims, especially in the central provinces, they had attempted to bring cases forward that related to wartime grievances and to have these adjudicated in these traditional customary courts. However, curiously and interestingly, these cases were dismissed because the traditional authorities who were judging these cases, they actually deemed that the amnesty law that was passed in Rome covered cases at the community level in these traditional courts too. So here we see another way that this dominant frame have limited efforts on the ground. And then finally, it's also observed in memorialization, where oftentimes wherever there is a plaque at some of these memorials that have been erected, there too isn't any discussion of what happened, who did what. Instead, the information that is presented there is very much done so in vague terms, in the sense that the war killed these people, as opposed to which side. And the other thing that is often present is simply what happened on that specific day, as opposed to how those events were connected to the larger civil conflict, the 16-year civil conflict that happened from 1976 to 1992. So I wanted to link this to the notion of the reconciliation that took place. And there's a reason why in the title reconciliation is in quotation marks. And it's because it took place without a formal acknowledgement of the crimes that happened in the past, the traumas that exist in communities. And because of that, I argue that it never addressed the root sources of the conflict situation, which sowed the seeds for the reemergence of armed conflict in the early 2010s. So just to talk about some of the effects of this frame and of the reconciliation process that took place, Frelimo's avoidance of the truth about this painful episode of the country's past, as well as its inability to tackle the socioeconomic root causes of the violence in the transitional and post-transitional stages, were likely contributing factors to the widely unanticipated renewal of hostilities between Renamo and Frelimo in 2013, which has on and off persisted until today. It has also played, in some ways, I would say, this failure to address the socioeconomic grievances, especially in the North, but also some of the structural inequalities that exist between the North and the South, in the outbreak of another conflict involving Islamist militants in the northern province of Cabo Delgado in 2017. So while that conflict is different from the one with Renamo, very much so, we do see some of these earlier themes of the root causes of the conflict being linked to socioeconomic grievances playing out and fueling that as well. So in terms of some of the takeaways, the main takeaway of this presentation and the chapter on Mozambique is that discourse matters. When a frame is set, it has implications for how policymakers envision solutions. In Mozambique, the initial response has meant that subsequent efforts have focused above all on the same solutions that were enacted in Rome in the early 1990s, even though it relates to newer conflicts now. And these have focused on the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of rebels, but also on the passage of blanket amnesty laws. And there have been 2 new amnesty laws that were passed subsequently in 2014 in a peace agreement that was signed between now President Armando Guebuza and Renamo leader Afonso Dhlakama, and most recently in 2018 to clear the way for the presidential elections then. But now between Filipe Nyusi and Dhlakama's successor, who, given that Dhlakama had passed away. But importantly, none of the responses since have included any form of acknowledgement, any form of accountability, or any form of willingness on in particular the government's part to uncover the truth about the past. So as a form of concluding remark, because I would like to leave some time for the discussion and the Q&A, just to wrap things up, this presentation, the larger book, it calls attention to the role of discourse and narratives and how we need to pay attention to them because they can serve as an obstacle to TJ efforts in addressing collective traumas at all levels, including locally. If you do have any questions or comments about this presentation, I invite you to email me. Thank you so much for your interest, and I look forward to your questions in the discussion.
Anna, you're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. My apologies. Thank you, David. Sorry, thank you, Adam, for that presentation again, for highlighting again some of the challenges and some of the dangers of fostering or trying to facilitate reconciliation in the absence of acknowledging the trauma, the suffering, especially of affected communities and individual victims, including indirect victims in that country. And we see what is happening in Mozambique currently with some of the conflict and even including some of the disaffection of the youths who continue to be excluded. And also we have seen the tensions between Frelimo and Renamo stemming from the 1992 civil war because of the issues that were not addressed, for instance, Thank you again for that presentation. We have 2 questions, and I'm going to read them and incorporate some of my questions to the panelists. We have about 12 minutes left before the end of our session. One of the questions asked by Ufra Mir from working in Kashmir and also Myanmar is asking the question. He's saying, I'm a peace psychologist and have been working with a healing-centered positive peace-building approach in Kashmir for a decade and now also in Myanmar. Since it's an ongoing conflict, not post, it gets even more tricky to work here, especially when there is no support from the government and the system is broken. What are your suggestions or recommendations or any insights into how one should go about this kind of context? The second question is from Valdi from the Trauma Center in Cape Town. Valdi van Rienenru, how do you view continuous traumatic stress, the work of Deborah Kamina and others who argue that post-trauma thinking does not take into account that trauma may not necessarily be post, but ongoing in communities experiencing high levels of violence? I will pose these questions to Angie and to Fidi and Yvonne.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Ufra. I'm just going to jump in because I'm quick, and then hope that Yvonne and Angie will also add their wisdom. Ufra Mir's question is, I think, quite a universal challenge in resource strained environments where there is no infrastructure. And what came to mind as a very interesting example of how to do a lot with very little is the Zimbabwean friendship bench example. And from here, I encourage you to have a look at that model. And I'm not saying you should use that model, but I think what is interesting methodologically is that here we have a country which is also resource strapped with very high levels of violence and trauma that goes back many, many years. And I think that also speaks to Valdi's question of the trauma is trauma ever really post, or does it always sit with us and we learn to live with it? But certainly the friendship bench model, which is based on the traditional notion that old ladies in communities are elders and are wise women who have the capacity to provide comfort and compassion and are good listeners, are sort of retrained with slightly more enhanced skills of counseling, and sit on benches that are scattered around the country at the moment and provide basic psychosocial support and counseling. And what I think is interesting about the model is that Zimbabweans, the team that worked behind this, Dixon Shibanda and his team, researched traditional existing structures that exist within society, that existed within Zimbabwean society, and enliven those. So my suggestion is what used to exist, what was there, and can that be worked with? And certainly talking to people who have been involved in these processes through a consultative approach, I'm sure will generate many interesting suggestions how in a fairly low cost way you can bring people to support one another. And I think Valdi's question is absolutely spot on. I agree with her. I don't think trauma is really ever post. I think it's a matter of living with it and making peace with it. And that's what transitional justice for me is about, is putting in place mechanisms and processes that help us live with the pain that has been caused in the past. I think the tragedy, of course, is that unfortunately, despite this being such a massive theoretical field, I think the actual concrete gains for victims and survivors around the world are very, very little. Over to the rest of the team.
I'll just add, thank you, Frederica. I fully agree with that. I do think that whether there's still an active conflict at the time does impact how work gets done, and we see that there's still all these effects in a supposedly post-conflict situation, but while the conflict is going, or we aren't officially in that phase, it really makes it difficult for work to be sustainable. I think what does happen, and that's what Frederic spoke to so eloquently, is that we mustn't underestimate how any interventions still are important and have an impact on people. That it's like doing hope as a verb, by connecting and by being able to talk from the past into the future, whatever mechanisms are used, is collectively helping for people to not feel totally lost and desperate. Thank you.
So I'll just add one little bit. I've put it in the chat, but if you're not familiar with Tani Adams, the late Tani Adams, and her work on chronic violence, mostly in Central America, I'd really recommend that you pull that out. She really talks about chronic violence as that place where there's not the good and the bad. We're all in the mix. It's the complexity that many of us have talked about with this. And she talks particularly about how trauma manifests in that space. And I think for both of your questions, there's a lot of really good work to dig into from Tani's work that she did before she passed on in 2016.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. I have a question for you, Adam, especially around the issue of reconciliation. And you have painted a picture for us again of the situation in Mozambique. And we see also from experience, we are reading about it as well, some of the implications, some of the impacts of not dealing with the issues that you have raised, for instance, issues of accountability, and again, trying to force reconciliation without actually acknowledgement of what happened. What I said in my opening remarks around frog marching a nation, frog marching a community, frog marching a society towards reconciliation, towards forgetting what happened so that we build a future that is uncertain, especially given that it's being built on a foundation that literally puts a thin layer over the experiences, the trauma and the pain and the hate experienced by those who were affected or whose rights were violated, for instance. So the reconciliation without acknowledgement, as you have painted the picture for Mozambique, for instance, how can we do it better? For instance, you gave some of the recommendations and some of the remarks, but what could be a model, for instance? And given that reconciliation is also a goal of peace building and even transitional justice processes that are usually employed towards addressing the consequences of conflict, what could be a better model towards reconciliation, and what kind of reconciliation would really achieve addressing trauma, addressing some of the consequences, the psychological consequences of conflict, for instance, for affected communities and for individuals? Is there a model in your research that came out that began to emerge around how we could address this in practice?
Yeah, I think one of the main takeaways for me is the need for this. I mean, in peace building, we talk about this all the time, but really the need for a long-term engagement and a long-term approach in these societies, both in terms of engaging the various communities in which transitional justice and peace building processes were taking place, but also at the national level. And part of the story here is the internationals, they were really eager at that time in 1992 to have a peace building success story. And when everyone was very tired with the war after the conflict and just wanted to move on, the international community was really keen. They were the first to say, well, Mozambique is a success story. Let's go on to, you know, the Congo or the next conflict that we have in the world and to shift the resources there. And important work was being done at that time, especially around reintegration. One of these questions that asks about how to address trauma when the government isn't particularly supportive, but there was really important work with very strapped resources being done in the area of psychosocial healing and trauma, especially with the reintegration of child soldiers by at first by an organization that was associated with the Mozambican Ministry of Public Health that was working with traditional healers in order to reintegrate child soldiers. However, when this organization became an NGO, Operation Rebuilding Hope, and they started to realize that many of these child soldiers were actually conscripted by the government, that's when they were stripped of their funding by the government and other types of organizations. That's when they really needed other organizations to support the work that they were doing, but instead they lost their funding, given that the international community had moved on. So that's a part of it. And a part of it too is that even though in that immediate post-conflict phase, there might be some fatigue with the conflict, the Mozambican case study, it does show that anyone who was paying attention to it knew that these issues were simmering. They were starting to bubble to the surface. And if anyone had have checked in or had taken this sort of long-term approach, 10 years after the Rome Agreement, there may have been an opening to revisit it, or after the renewal of hostilities, there may have been an opening to revisit it or to pressure both sides in order to include some sort of accountability mechanism in these subsequent peace agreements, but that never happened. Instead, an amnesty happened, and I think it's partly because of the way that we understand what's going on there.
Thank you, Adam. Probably my last question, and drawing from part of what Adam said around the fact that we need to engage in long-term processes, especially if we are to achieve reconciliation. And the healing process itself is a long drawn process, for instance, and part of the challenge, even in fundraising or funding this work of dealing with collective trauma, or even dealing with trauma, even if it's individual trauma, is the fact that you cannot put a timeline on healing for an individual, let alone for a community or for a society that is emerging from conflict. And this is part of where it really fails in terms of the international community that may want to assist a country to transition from conflict to peace. So to hear from practitioners and to hear from you, for instance, what needs to happen, what needs to shift in order for us to prioritize addressing the trauma, the collective trauma and individual trauma. What needs to shift on the side of the funders, on the side of the recipients on the ground, and on the side of government, if we are to realistically and really holistically address trauma in society, in communities, in families, and in the lives of individuals who are affected?
That's a very big question, but I'm going to try to tackle it, and maybe some of the other panelists can also add their thoughts. But well, for me, as I mentioned, I have an built-in assumption that all transitional justice processes are going to be framed and they're going to be political. So one of the only ways to sort of circumvent that, because governments will try to sort of own the narrative, it's to empower those who are on the ground, the survivors themselves. However, this requires a fundamental shift in the way that localization is actually being taken place, that it's not that locals are simply being seen as the beneficiaries of these different types of processes and engagements, as being the sort of the partners and paying lip service to them, but actually truly allowing them to own this process and then supporting whatever process that is from the bottom up, even if it might be one that the donors might not necessarily agree with. So those are kind of my thoughts. It does, I think, yeah, it requires a bit of a shift in thinking, so, and practice.
Fiti, Yvonne, Angie, any thoughts on the question?
Yes, I have lots of thoughts on the question, Anna, understandably, because that's what we're busy with. I think we need to challenge the silos, this notion that we can't work together. And I think the fact that interdisciplinary work across disciplines is increasing globally, I think is very positive. We need to do a lot of awareness raising and training. And I think we need to make the case. We need to make a business case for why, and it sounds crass and you know, business is not necessarily something we often use as a metaphor in the social justice work that we do, but we need to make a hard case for how and why peace building cannot operate without mental health and psychosocial support. And I think that needs to include scientific data. It needs to include the neuroscience that Angie was talking about. It needs to make really, really clear that without ensuring that people's psychological wounds have healed, which allows the rebuilding of trust and hope and faith, which is what was mentioned in the video earlier on, we cannot expect people to recover. And I think once that hard case has been made, and that is then taken to national governments, to international organizations, and I think here in Africa, we really need to work closely with the African Union, for instance, but also with even bigger international institutions to make sure that this is known. We need a policy that ensures that peace building is inclusive of MHPSS. And in order to achieve all of that, we need to do lobbying, we need to do advocacy, we need to do awareness raising, we need to do training, and we need to keep the conversation going. And that's what I'm certainly very grateful for CSVR, that you're doing this by hosting these webinars, because I think that the sort of trickle down effect is wide. You know, we have people from across the world participating in this conversation, and the more we have these conversations, the less these issues will be ignored. Over to you.
I actually have something also quickly to add there. I think 5 years ago, I felt like it was a very alone space, and I was happy to meet Fidi in the middle of Juba and be able to talk about this because nobody else was talking about this, or to find a few other people. And it's now the buzzword. It's now what people are starting to talk about. They're asking, how can this be done? The donor community, it's changing. Like I said, DFID has something on the works. They're putting it together. They're thinking about it. USAID's, I don't even know what the bureaus are called anymore because everything's changing, but the CMM is thinking about it. They're asking, they're putting out TORs to say, what's happening in this field? How can we start to understand that? And 10 years ago, when I was within USAID and I was trying to get it out within the institution, everyone just called me the trauma lady, you know, and would run away from me as they saw me. And today that's really changing. And I think it's changing because of the work that Fidi and Yvonne and Mariam and so many of you, Eugenia, people here who are on here, what you're doing, and we're getting it out and we're publishing. So publishing evaluations and research, publishing these understandings of how this works, I think is really critical. And Fidi, you know, let's take a look at how the adverse childhood experiences has shaped how they've now explained why investing in ACEs is so important today for the future and how much it costs if you don't invest in it. I think that has a real parallel for how we can actually explain why our work needs this kind of investment.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There is a question for Adam. Adam, maybe you can take it quickly, just in 1 minute as we wrap up. Magdalena Freshlad is saying, at Adam, I agree about the importance of discourse, but in the context of Mozambique, how or whom would you consider could change this discourse, given the fact that both Renamo and Frelimo are not interested in changing the narrative? And is it really necessary?
Yeah, thanks so much, Magdalena, for your question. And I would be really keen to talk more with you about this offline. But to answer it here, I actually do think that Renamo is a little bit more open to such a process than it was in 1992, because it benefits them politically to have a little bit more of a balanced narrative, and they have expressed in my interviews some interest in even restoring their image a little bit. So there is that opening that happened in the early 2010s in order to potentially deal with some things at the national level. The extent to which it's actually genuine as opposed to rhetorical is of course questionable, given that these issues didn't make their way into any of the peace agreements. But the other is through, I think, some of the sort of lobbying, advocacy, awareness raising activities that I think could really potentially embolden civil society. I know of one women's rights organization that was working with various survivors, and they had an awareness raising week on transitional justice. And it was through that some of the female survivors had expressed a desire for reparations, just they were talking about it in different ways, that yes, all these bad things happened to me during the war, and I think that I should get some sort of compensation for this. So again, this sort of points to this these demands at the grassroots level for transitional justice responses. And for that reason, given I do have a bit of a victim-centered approach, I do think it's necessary, but also nationally, if you don't deal with the past, it could lead to the resumption of conflict. And we're seeing that now. So that's also why I think it's a necessary step forward.
Thank you, Adam, for responding to the question. And I would like to thank our panelists, Adam, Fidi, Yvonne, and Angie, for the excellent reflections you have given us today, building onto the work that you are doing, but also backing it up also with documentation, documenting some of these experiences, enriching the field with some of your experiences and some of your reflections and some of the key takeaways and findings in the work that you are doing, something which we really need. Fidi spoke earlier about the need for us to lobby, the need for advocacy efforts towards ensuring that we build the momentum around the gains that have been made so far. Some of the key questions that victims are asking, that funders are asking, responding to some of those. And what I really took away from this meeting, amongst other things, is that there has been and there continues to be indigenous knowledge, expertise, and methods and approaches and strategies to addressing some of the collective trauma issues. There are already processes on the ground at a micro level, at a community level, aimed towards healing and addressing collective trauma, what we can build upon. And also the African approach to this is incorporating some of these learnings, some of this expertise, the indigenous learning, and bringing it and enriching it towards ensuring that we have a healed Africa. We have an Africa that has addressed its trauma, that also works towards achieving peace that is sustainable, and building individuals who can positively contribute to the development and governance and democratic processes of their country. And those who can do this are only those who have gone through a healing process, who have resolved some of the trauma, and addressing this trauma at multiple levels, from individual levels, family level, community level, societal level, and at leadership levels where it really matters the most. Thank you so much for your presentations. And I'd like to correct my earlier statement. Valdi left the Trauma Center, is currently heading the Violence Prevention Agency. Thank you, Valdi, again, and thank you, Ufra. Thank you, Magdalena, and other participants who posed questions. And thank you to all our participants who took time out of their very busy schedules to be with us in today's discussions. And thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to CSVR staff who've been working behind the scenes to make this webinar a success. Thank you to everyone for today's deliberations, and also for bringing some of the critical questions that are really pertinent, that are important in taking this work forward and entrenching it, ensuring that healing Africa becomes a reality. for all at various levels and in all our diversity as Africans. Thank you so much.